February 28, 2026. A date that would be etched into the memory of every resident of Tehran. What began as an ordinary evening, with families gathering for dinner and children finishing their homework, would soon descend into chaos and terror. The city's peaceful rhythm was shattered in an instant. The hum of traffic and distant laughter was replaced by a sudden chilling silence that seemed to hang in the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then, the air raid sirens began to wail, a sound that most people had only heard in old war documentaries or stories from their grandparents. Now it was real, echoing through every street and alley, a warning that danger was imminent. Suddenly, the night sky erupted in bursts of orange and red. Explosions tore through the darkness, fireballs streaking above the rooftops, casting an eerie glow over the city. The distant rumble of missiles and the sharp crack of detonations filled the air. The ground trembled with each blast, windows rattling in their frames. People screamed and ducked for cover, panic spreading like wildfire. In a matter of seconds, the city was transformed from a place of routine into a landscape of fear and confusion. Phones buzzed and screens flashed with urgent messages. Missiles incoming. Seek shelter immediately. The words were stark, their meaning unmistakable. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen such an alert. And the reality of war hit home. Crowds surged toward metro stations and underground shelters, desperate for safety. Some people ran, clutching children or dragging loved ones behind them. Others stood frozen in the streets, eyes wide with disbelief, staring up at the burning sky as if unable to comprehend what was happening. Sirens from emergency vehicles wailed alongside the cries of the terrified. Shouting and confusion filled the air as targeted strikes hit government districts like Pasteur Street, sending shockwaves through the heart of the city. The chaos was overwhelming, with people unsure where to go or what to do. Windows shattered under the force of the blasts, glass raining down onto the streets below. Buildings shook, debris fell, and the city's familiar rhythm was replaced by the relentless noise of destruction. Every explosion seemed to erase a piece of normal life. For families huddled in their homes, the threat of war was no longer an abstract idea on the news. It was terrifyingly real. Explosions rattling their walls, flashes of light illuminating their faces as they clung to each other, praying for safety. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the attacks were over, others whispered that more missiles were on the way. Fear grew with every passing minute, and no one knew the true toll of the devastation. The uncertainty was as suffocating as the smoke in the air. In crowded shelters and darkened homes, millions of Tehranis waded through a long, sleepless night. Every distant boom, every flicker of light on the horizon brought new waves of anxiety. All anyone could do was hope for dawn and pray that their loved ones were safe. The city was unrecognizable, its streets deserted, its people huddled together in fear. Life had been upended in a single night, and everywhere, the sense of dread was palpable. As dawn finally broke over a damaged and smoke-filled skyline, Tehran faced a new reality. The nightmare was far from over. For its people, the long night of fire and fear was only the beginning of an uncertain future. As Tehran burned, the world demanded answers. The city's skyline, once a symbol of resilience, was now shrouded in smoke and chaos. News of the attacks spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through capitals across the globe. People everywhere watched in disbelief as images of destruction filled their screens, and questions about who was responsible and why echoed in every corner of the international community. The US and Israel soon stepped forward, claiming responsibility for the coordinated strikes. Their military jets had not only targeted Tehran, but also unleashed firepower on other major Iranian cities like Isfahan and Qom. The attacks were swift, precise, and devastating, leaving emergency services scrambling to respond amid the chaos. According to official statements, the primary objective was clear: to cripple Iran's nuclear and military capabilities before they could pose a greater threat. Key military facilities, suspected nuclear sites, and critical infrastructure were all targeted in an effort to neutralize Iran's ability to retaliate or escalate the conflict further. These strikes did not come out of nowhere. Years of failed negotiations, mounting distrust, and repeated accusations over Iran's nuclear ambitions had brought the situation to a boiling point. Diplomatic efforts had repeatedly stalled, and international talks had broken down, leaving the world on edge and the region teetering on the brink of war. At press conferences, US and Israeli officials described the strikes as preemptive measures, They insisted that intelligence showed Iran was dangerously close to building a nuclear weapon, and that waiting any longer would have been a catastrophic mistake. The world's media scrambled to keep up, broadcasting urgent updates and expert analysis. President Trump addressed the nation and the world, declaring the attacks necessary to protect American lives, allies in the region, and the broader international order. He emphasized that the decision was not made lightly, but was driven by a sense of duty to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. Israel echoed these sentiments. Prime Minister Netanyahu warned that the risks of inaction had simply become too great. He argued that Israel could not afford to wait any longer, as the threat from Iran was growing by the day, and demanded immediate action. For years, the conflict had played out in the shadows, through cyber attacks, sabotage, and proxy battles across the region. But now, the shadow war had erupted into open conflict with missiles flying and soldiers on the ground. The world watched as a new, more dangerous chapter began. Yet this bold gamble by the US and Israel risked igniting a much larger, uncontrollable war. As military convoys mobilized and civilians fled their homes, global leaders rushed into emergency meetings, desperately searching for a way to contain the crisis before it spiraled even further out of control. In minutes, Iran shut its airspace, grounding all civilian flights. The world's busiest air corridors fell silent. Flights were diverted or canceled, chaos rippling through global aviation. Israel followed, closing its skies and declaring a state of emergency. Air raid sirens blared across Israeli cities, signaling real danger. Flight trackers showed planes rerouting over Saudi Arabia and Turkey, creating new bottlenecks. The closures disrupted not just travel, but global commerce and cargo. Empty skies became a stark symbol. This was no ordinary crisis. Both nations braced for sustained conflict, with the world watching anxiously. The air had become a battlefield, and the stakes were global. On Tehran streets, fear was everywhere. Metro stations became crowded shelters, families huddled together, faces drawn with exhaustion. Information was scarce, rumors of destruction and casualties spread wildly. Every decision, stay or run, felt impossible. Parents tried to comfort terrified children as explosions echoed above. Community bonds grew stronger, but helplessness was overwhelming. The city's routines vanished, replaced by survival instincts and constant anxiety. For Tehran's people, war was no longer politics. It was a fight to stay alive. The attacks sent shockwaves through the global economy. Oil prices soared as traders feared Iran's production and exports would halt. Higher oil costs meant rising prices for fuel, food, and goods worldwide. The Strait of Hormuz, a vital oil choke point, was suddenly at risk. Any disruption there could trigger shortages and a global energy crisis. The world's economic stability now hinged on events in the Middle East. Leaders watched nervously, hoping escalation wouldn't spark a full-blown crisis. The conflict's reach was immediate. No one was immune to its effects. Leaders rushed to justify their actions. President Trump called the strikes a defensive necessity, warning Iran's government was to blame. Israel's prime minister echoed the attacks were to stop an existential threat. Both nations framed their actions as preemptive self-defense. In Tehran, outrage and vows of revenge filled the airwaves. Iran's leaders condemned the barbaric act, promising a crushing response. Each side's rhetoric hardened, leaving little room for compromise. The world saw three narratives: defense, deterrence, and defiance colliding. The language of leaders made de-escalation seem almost impossible. For ordinary people, the crisis was devastating. In Tehran, families lived in fear, children unable to sleep, parents desperate for safety. In Israel, air raid sirens and closed airspace revived old anxieties. Civilians on both sides faced constant uncertainty, trapped by the cycle of attack and retaliation. Neighboring countries braced for refugees and instability. The region's fragile stability teetered on the edge. Millions already displaced by past wars now faced new threats. The true cost was measured in lost homes, shattered lives, and interrupted dreams. While leaders spoke of strategy, families just wanted peace. The human toll was the crisis's most tragic and overlooked consequence. Iran's promised retaliation came swiftly, missiles launched at Israel, air raid sirens sent Israelis scrambling for cover as Iron Dome interceptors lit up the night. Each side saw the attacks as proof of their own narratives: strength, defense, necessity. The tit-for-tat escalated, with analysts warning of a wider war. Every missile risked mass casualties or a catastrophic miscalculation. The region was trapped in a deadly loop: attack, defense, retaliation. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their fate tied to military decisions. The violence had entered a volatile new phase, with disaster always one step away. The logic of war left no easy exit. As the dust settled, the Middle East stood at a crossroads. The echoes of explosions still lingered in the air, and the devastation was visible on every street corner. In the aftermath, uncertainty gripped the region, as leaders and citizens alike tried to make sense of what had happened and what the future might hold. The world pleaded for restraint, hoping for a ceasefire and renewed dialogue. International organizations scrambled to mediate, while peace activists took to the streets, demanding an end to the violence. In capitals across the globe, urgent meetings were held, and statements of concern echoed from every corner. But mistrust and anger ran deep, making compromise unlikely. Decades of unresolved grievances and recent bloodshed fueled suspicion on all sides. Negotiators faced impossible odds, as every gesture was scrutinized and every word weighed for hidden meaning. Hardliners pushed for escalation, risking a wider multi-front war. Military leaders mobilized their forces, preparing for the possibility of further conflict. The threat of new attacks loomed large, and the region braced for what could come next. Ordinary people waited anxiously, bracing for more violence. Families huddled together in shelters, glued to their televisions and phones, desperate for any sign of hope or safety. The fear of the unknown weighed heavily on everyone, from children to the elderly. The global economy, humanitarian concerns, and the threat of major war hung in the balance. Markets tumbled, supply chains faltered, and aid organizations rushed to deliver food and medicine to those in need. The specter of a humanitarian crisis grew with each passing hour. The situation was fluid. Peace or catastrophe could hinge on a single decision. In war rooms and command centers, leaders weighed their options, knowing that any misstep could trigger consequences far beyond their borders. The events had changed the region forever, leaving scars and uncertainty. Communities mourned their losses, and the landscape itself bore witness to the cost of conflict. The pain of the past mingled with anxiety about what the future might bring. The world watched, hoping peace would prevail over war. News outlets broadcast live updates, and people everywhere held their breath, waiting to see if diplomacy could triumph over destruction. The next chapter was unwritten, and the stakes had never been higher. As dawn broke over the battered cities, the world stood on the edge of history, uncertain but still hoping that a path to peace could be found before it was too late.